Moving on to our webinar today. This is an issue of particular interest to me. I was lucky enough to live in Canada for 6 years. I did both my master's and PhD in Canada. My two sons are both Canadian citizens, and I've got my older son with me right now in Los Angeles, and we've had a lot of great stimulating conversations about the future of Canadian politics. And of course, our topic today is the resignation of Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, which marks a significant turning point in Canada's political landscape and, of course, its role on the global stage. Trudeau has been instrumental as leader of the Liberal Party and as Prime Minister in shaping Canada's progressive policies on climate, diversity, social justice, while also, of course, navigating the challenges of COVID-19, strained U.S. Canada relations, and, of course, economic pressures. His departure signals a shift in leadership style and in policy direction, in Canada's domestic priorities and its approach to international issues, particularly the bilateral relationship with the US. We're now waiting to see how the Liberal Party navigates its leadership transition, how the country prepares for an impending general election, in which the Conservative Party is projected to achieve significant gains. To help us navigate this complex and fascinating political landscape in Canada, we have two extraordinary experts with us. Hannah Thibedeau is an award-winning Canadian journalist with over 25 years of experience, including more than 2 decades covering Parliament Hill. She earned a degree in political science from Dalhousie University and a television broadcasting diploma from Algonquin College. Throughout her career, Thibedeau has reported for various media outlets, including CBC News, where she served as national news anchor. In 2023, she and her team won the Canadian Screen Award for Best Live News Special for their coverage of the Ottawa occupation. In April of last year, Hannah transitioned from journalism to become the Executive Communications Officer at Global Public Affairs, a leading Canadian strategic communications and government relations consultancy. Welcome, Hannah, and thank you so much for being with us today and lending us your expertise.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Now over to Chris Sands. Chris Sands is the director of the Canada Institute at the Wilson Centre, where he leads research and analysis on U.S. Canada relations, focusing on trade, security, and cross-border cooperation. With extensive expertise in North American affairs, Chris has contributed significantly to fostering dialogue and understanding between policymakers, business leaders, and scholars in both countries. Prior to joining the Wilson Centre, he held leadership roles at prominent think tanks and academic institutions, including the Hudson Institute and the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, SICE. Chris is widely recognized for his insights into trade agreements, energy policy, and the broader dynamics shaping North America. On a personal note, I just want to say that Chris is one of the funniest people I've ever met. He is a truly extraordinary colleague, highly collaborative. And when I was with him at the Wilson Centre, I feel like we made a great team working on North American issues covering Mexico and Canada. He was always a terrific sounding board, a great guy to grab a post-work drink with. But just as importantly, he has an amazing wife, Victoria, with whom I share an enormous interest in British baked goods. And he also has a lovely dog, Pip, who is the cutest little ball of fluff you can ever imagine. And with that introduction, let me turn it over to you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Duncan. And I am lucky that I'm outshone by both my dog and my wife. But my dog is charming. My wife is a great baker, and I'm lucky to know them both. And to you also, Duncan. Let me talk a little bit about where we are very broadly. I'm going to turn it over to Hannah because she's been covering this day to day to talk about some of the machinations. But Duncan's given us the beginning and I think the most important pieces. Justin Trudeau took over the leadership of the Liberal Party in 2014 when it was really quite broken down. A long-running feud between a more statist Francophone faction within the party and a more market-oriented Anglophone division in the party had really crippled them, led to Stephen Harper, his successful governments, ending with a majority government in his last mandate. People thought the Liberal Party might be left for dead at that point. Justin Trudeau came in, he was young, he was energetic, he was dynamic, and he turned the party around. Taking government in 2015 with a majority government, he was able to reorient the party, bring in lots of new members, and lead through first a very good partnership with Barack Obama, followed by a period where he tried to work with the first Trump administration, looking for areas of common ground. It wasn't easy, but he was able to end the first Trump administration with a new trade agreement, the United States Mexico-Canada Agreement, the USMCA, which Canadians refer to as CUSMA, the Canada U.S.-Mexico agreement. We can't even agree on the name. That's not a great start. But but he was able to keep that part of Canada's very, very important national interest, the trade relationship with the U.S., in good shape. Then the Biden administration came. He looked to partner with the Biden administration on a number of issues. And at the very end, almost 10 years in power, he saw his poll numbers falling. Not primarily, I think, because of Donald Trump, but primarily because people had grown tired of him, tired of his personality. Not uncommon in Canadian politics. Many other politicians hit a similar mark and lost their support. But he leaves at a critical time with the start of the second Trump administration and many issues in flux. With that, let me turn it over to my good friend Hannah to talk a little bit about where we are and where the Canadian political system is right now and how we get from here to someplace better.
Thanks, Chris. Chris and I always enjoy gabbing with each other, and I think that's what this is going to be, kind of a conversation between the two of us. We catch up this way, so I think you're going to enjoy some of the discussion that it's almost going to be live with you. So let me just take you back to what Chris was talking about there, and to kind of show you how Prime Minister Trudeau came into power. During that election campaign back in 2015, he was in third place coming into this. The Liberals, as Chris was saying, they were having a really tough time. They'd gone through quite a few different leaders. And then Justin Trudeau came in and took over the leadership. In that election campaign, he brought the party from third place and won in that election campaign. I think it surprised the Prime Minister at the time. He underestimated how much the people of Canada wanted change. I think Justin Trudeau came in on a wave of hope back in 2015. After we're almost 10 years with him as Prime Minister, I think Canadians, and what you see exactly as Chris is saying, there is this sort of lifespan for governments in Canada. And starting in the summertime, you felt it even before then. Canadians were getting tired of him, but then his MPs started to realize that we're going to have a problem getting reelected if we still have Justin Trudeau as our leader. So there started to become these cracks within his caucus. And then the caucus started speaking out. Originally in the summertime, there were about 20 or so who signed on to say he should step down as leader. Now that continued and there was momentum, but Trudeau was holding on strong. That was until, bam, the Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister, his right-hand person for so long, decided that she was going to resign the day of the fall fiscal update. And as Chris was saying, I still jump in to do analysis for CTV News now. I used to be at CBC, but I jump in, I get called on to do analysis. So that day was just something I have not seen in my 20-something years, to have the right-hand person of the Prime Minister basically come out and say that the Prime Minister was using political gimmicks to stay in power, and those are the exact word, political gimmicks, while she wanted, as Finance Minister, to keep Canada's fiscal powder dry. Now, what I'm talking about is the Prime Minister gave Canadians a GST holiday on certain things, and that's a tax that we have here, on things like Christmas trees, alcohol, children's toys, restaurant bills, and that cost the coffers billions of dollars. He also wanted to give a $250 rebate to every Canadian who made under $150,000. Billions of dollars. Chrystia Freeland, our Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister at the time, adamantly agreed with this. the Friday before the Monday. So on the Friday, she was pulled in to the Prime Minister's office and told, okay, we're going to essentially demote you. We're going to give you a role that is not even a cabinet position. Mark Carney, and we'll get to Mark Carney soon, he's the former governor of the Bank of Canada and also the former governor of the Bank of England, who went through all the Brexit stuff, was going to replace her. But we still want you to deliver the fiscal update on Monday. And she felt it was a bag of poo, to put it in.
That is true.
And didn't agree with it. So on Monday morning, and this was reported by our colleagues at the Globe and Mail, Bob Fife, I want to give him full cred for this. The Prime Minister pulls up to the Parliament buildings, is in his SUV, gets a call from Ms. Freeland saying, this is going to happen. She drops this bombshell. He has nobody to read his fiscal update. And essentially, that was the end of Justin Trudeau at that point. He had no way to come back. And it was just giving the official opposition and Pierre Poilievre just full steam ahead on, look, you can call him, he uses political gimmicks to stay in power. He financially and fiscally, he's not doing things properly. So that was the impetus for him to step down. Do you want to jump in at all there, Chris, before I go forward? Because it's been
Yeah,
a crazy couple of weeks here in Ottawa.
It was, and I was going to ask, there was that moment where we didn't know if he was going to resign or not. We got through the fiscal statement. He did find somebody to read it. There was a question, was he going to go? Was he going to stay? His position looked terrible. More people defected from his cabinet. And
Yeah.
then he chose this day that we remember in the US for very different reasons. January 6th, a Monday.
Oh, absolutely.
In Washington, the Congress is certifying the election of Donald Trump for a second term, and in Canada, he pulls the plug. Could there have been a worse time? I know many people have said that he's really left his party in the lurch. Could there have been a worse time for him to pull that?
No, because it's not only that, he also, so yes, on January 6th, that was the day he decided to pull the plug. Another crazy Monday, another day of sitting on the set all day, so exciting in the news industry. And I was happy to join them for analysis on it. And my analysis on that is he left the party in turmoil. He left, basically, I don't mean to sound like callous about this, but he is a lame duck prime minister now. And also he left the country in peril. And I say that it couldn't have been a worse time, because what are we facing on Monday? We are, and leading up to this, we are facing that threat of 25% tariffs being slammed on this country at a time where the economy is still teetering. We're trying to get things back together. So now we know, okay, at least they've shut down Parliament. At least, I mean, I know the opposition's not happy about that, but it gives them time to reset. There's not a lot of time. And I'll just tell you what my analysis is on this. What happens is when the new leader's chosen, the new leader has until March 24th to come up with a speech from the throne. Because when you prorogue or suspend Parliament here, all the bills are suspended. And basically you have to start from scratch again. You can reintroduce them if there is agreement from all parties. That is something that can potentially happen. But on March 24th, they have to come back with a speech from the throne. That is a chance for the opposition parties to bring down the government. All opposition parties have said that they will clearly bring down the government as soon as they can, because there is no confidence in this government.
Now, two quick things. One is prorogation. So there's no question period. It's sort of like a recess, except it does, as you say, reset Parliament. And it goes until March 24th. The speech from the throne, I know people who compare that to sort of like a State of the Union, except that it's much more important in the sense that it's read, but it's written by the government. So it is their platform, right?
Absolutely. So what we expect from this is that the new leader, whoever becomes the new leader, will become the new prime minister. So you don't just become the leader of the party, you will become also the prime minister of this country. if they are smart in any way, shape, or form, they want to control how they fall. They do not want the opposition to take them down on their agenda. So putting this out, a speech from the throne, basically they write it for the Governor General reads it. This will be their agenda for the future. This will be what they go into the election campaign on. So whoever becomes the next leader, you will see it laid out all how they plan to run this government. So that is going to make some things clear for Canadians. And then if the government does fall, which I suspect that week of March 24th, that means for Canada a May 5th or a May 12th election date, because we have election laws that say it's 37 to 51 days for election campaigns. And if I figured out the math, I think it's those dates in there. So that's what we have to be watching for now, Chris. But yes, expect that speech from the throne to be very important, but also it lays out what the budget would look like and the spending in this country.
The Liberals will choose a replacement. If I have the date right, on the 7th of March or something like that, there's
9th of March.
9th of March. That's when the party members will vote who they would like to be the new leader of the party, who, as you said, becomes the new prime minister. In a way, the other date that I know a lot of people are looking at is April, because normally in mid-April we see the budget, and the fall economic statement was quite late. Normally it's in October. It came as late as December, and so we got a glimpse of what the economic picture looks like. Canada's in big deficit. There are lots of fiscal problems, and normally the budget comes out in April. Markets usually look for that. But if there's an election, there'll be sort of the equivalent of a continuing resolution. Government will keep spending, but on the same track, and we won't see a budget until after the election. Is that right?
That's potential. They could come out and say, here is our speech from the throne. You can assume what the budget will be from that. But yes, don't expect, they build the budget off of the speech from the throne. And
Sure.
if you can't get past that, then there's no opportunity for the government to put forward a budget. However, the Liberals have been saying, and I don't know where they're getting this from, they have had the NDP, which is an opposition party, have an agreement with them so they wouldn't fall. Now that was pulled last year, and it's a supply and confidence agreement. So essentially, they believe that they could put something in this throne speech that would keep them from falling. However, Jagmeet Singh has come out and his party has clearly said that they are not supporting this government any further. How they would be convinced otherwise, I'm not 100% sure, but we have heard some Liberals and some Liberals very close to the Prime Minister saying that potentially there's still a way to convince the NDP to support them. I don't see it, but just putting that out there that that's still in the discussions.
So this is my annoying professor side, but a couple of key things that you've highlighted there. One is that the Liberals have 153 seats in the current parliament. That is less than the 170 out of 338 that is required to have a majority. Now, in places from Israel to Italy, you often see coalition governments. Here, you don't have one. You have what's called a minority government, a government that governs without a majority and is always at risk of falling. And the NDP gave them the backing to keep them in power. It is, and this is my question for you, it is possible that, say, if there's a progressive person, possibly somebody who knows where the money is, like Chrystia Freeland, and she offers something concrete to the NDP to let them get to a budget where the budget will include, say, pharmacare or some other benefit that the NDP would love to have to add to social programs, that there could be a deal. But the Conservatives are hoping that the new government doesn't have a chance to be popular at all, because they would like to take advantage of their polling lead right now and go into an election.
Absolutely. You can tell, though, that for some of the leadership candidates, there is some concern from the Conservatives. And I say that because they automatically go out and attack, and they're not even in the Liberal leadership. They're not the Liberal leader at this point. For example, Mark Carney. Mark Carney I think has them a little bit concerned. And the reason for that is he was our governor of the Bank of Canada here. He helped deal with a really tough economic time in Canada when he was there, when he was the bank of the governor of in Europe, in
Bank of England.
London, England, excuse me. He also took that country when Brexit was happening. So you can tell there is some concern with that. And his performance last night, he was on Jon Stewart last night. He was kind of funny. He was a little bit funny. And so he hasn't announced yet. We do expect that he will announce on Thursday of this week. And Carney was saying things essentially, you know, he is not the traditional liberal, because a lot of people are saying if you're tied to Justin Trudeau, there's no way you'll get elected. And then also you're talking about Chrystia Freeland, who knows where the money is as well. We're expecting her to announce later this week too. So yeah, there is a bit of concern from the official opposition. So hypothetically, the government doesn't fall on the speech from the throne. And I think that's very hypothetical. We do have a fixed election date here. So the longest this government could go would be October of this year. So that is, yeah.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about Pierre Poilievre, who is the leader of the Conservatives. His party's been about 20 points ahead, plus or minus, for almost a year. He's considered to be, in some ways, the most likely winner of the next election, which even before this had to happen by October 20th, 2025. So we've been in election mode for a while. What's your impression of him? And I'll just show you, put my cards on the table. I have a bit of a hypothesis that his poll numbers are people wanting to vote against Justin Trudeau, not necessarily people supporting him or his program. And there's a bit of a danger, I wonder, that his numbers will collapse when he's up against somebody who isn't Justin Trudeau, and that maybe people find more appealing. But can you talk a little bit about Pierre Poilievre and what he represents and how he's approached things?
Absolutely. Pierre Poilievre, as we heard from Chris there, has led the polls for, I think it's over a year, maybe we're hitting into 2 years, in the 20-point lead. And I would agree with Chris on this, is that there was just this exhaustion with Canadians. And when I go across the country, I always talk to people. Still, it's a part of the journalism that I have in my head. And it's like, so what do you think? And they just didn't like him anymore. It was this visceral distaste for how he was talking to people, that he brought the party too far to the left with the supply and confidence agreement so joining with the NDP. What they really want to see, and this is something that we heard from former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien over the weekend, is that they want the radical center, that people are trying to find this middle ground. What Pierre Poilievre has done, and I wouldn't say he's radical center by any means, I would put him more to the right, and he is not a Donald Trump. We have heard people compare him to a Donald Trump. I think he's really filling that space where Canadians are like, we don't want Justin Trudeau. We want another option out there. So he has promised to cut the carbon tax, which is a tax on carbon here in Canada. A lot of people have felt a pinch on that because of when they had pay for certain supplies in the East Coast of Canada. A lot of Canadians, and this is a little bit more difficult to explain, but a lot of Canadians heat their homes with oil. They were feeling it, so they did get a reprieve on that because they were pushing for that from the federal government. So they got a reprieve on that. But with that carbon tax, he's really sold that as, look, this is hitting your pocketbook, and he's won the argument on that. So he wants to have what he calls a carbon tax election. I think he really should start changing his discussion points on that, because I think it's beyond a carbon tax election at this point. I think it's, bringing in the American side to that, which I'm sure Chris and I will discuss in a moment, and the fear of those 25% tariffs. But people are looking for an option out there that was not Justin Trudeau. And when it comes to Pierre Poilievre, it's things like cutting the carbon tax, balancing the books. He has 5 points. He sticks to those 5 points. But when it comes to delving into the issues. He hasn't put out a lot of policies as of yet. I know they wait for election campaigns to discuss those. They're kind of fluctuating and figuring out where Canadians want to see things go. But at this point, if we were having an election today, it would be a Conservative government.
Well, I know this is a really annoying habit about Americans that we talk about foreign affairs, but in the end, we really just want to talk about ourselves. So, as the American of the two of us, I'm going to bring this in here because it seemed to me that part of the discussion in Canada and within the Liberal Party was a question of who is going to deal with Donald Trump. As it became
Mhm.
clearer that Donald Trump was going to replace Joe Biden as president, that became sort of the focus of everyone's thinking. And Justin Trudeau did something quite remarkable. He had had a parliamentary committee looking at Canada-US relations. He had a cabinet committee looking at Canada-US relations. He had been consulting widely with an effort he called Team Canada 2, which had some Liberal cabinet ministers reaching out and Ambassador Kirsten Hillman here in Washington reaching out. So he had a lot of efforts, but then without telling anyone of those people, he suddenly decided he was going to go down to Mar-a-Lago and he was going to sit with Donald Trump and try to talk about how he could work on border security and stopping fentanyl and dealing with migration, all things that Donald Trump had raised. Um, it was, to my mind, very similar to what he did in 2016, which is to sort of not get flustered by the bluster and focus on can we do business on these issues. And in 2016, I think I was among those people who praised him for kind of keeping his cool and finding a way to get along with the United States, even though you couldn't have had a bigger contrast between Barack Obama and Donald Trump in terms of ease for Justin Trudeau. He
Yeah.
really sucked it up, found a way to get forward, and I think I thought he did very well there. But this second time, part of what Chrystia Freeland criticized the prime minister for in her resignation was this sense that you just go in and you kind of hopefully beg for, I don't know, a break, where she thought Canada needed to be in a position to fight. And I think that that appeals to Canadians, and it will be the same with Mark Carney. But now I don't, this is a long question, but I'm trying to set you up
I want to
here.
let me ask you.
Sure.
This is how Chris and I kind of go about these things. So first off, because I want to play devil's advocate, so I see two sides to
Sure.
that trip to Mar-a-Lago. What was your original impression? Because I woke up and I'm like, wow, he went to Mar-a-Lago. And then I had my thoughts. What were your first thoughts?
My first thoughts were, this is great. He has found a way to cut through. He didn't just do a phone call, which many world leaders did. I
Mhm,
think the world's been a little puzzled because um, this isn't normal. We have inauguration next week. It's not President Trump is not president again. It's confusing because Americans call people president and ambassador and whatever long
yeah.
after they leave their job. That's our weird way. So he is President Trump, but he's really just President-elect Trump. He's not in power. But so many world leaders have been trying to do business with him, and partly that's because President Biden, I think, in some ways has been a more diminished figure since the election. He has not been in the news in quite the same way, although I think working very, very hard. So I initially thought this was really great. But then, and then I thought a second thought, which is I was worried that Donald Trump, I'll be fair to Trudeau. Trudeau, after Trump left office and Biden came in, Trudeau began to use MAGA and MAGA light as ways of criticizing the conservatives in Canada. And
Mhm,
you were right on the scene with the Freedom Trucker protests, which
mhm.
froze Ottawa. And you should talk about those a little bit. But the prime minister suggested that this was a January 6th insurrection, and he invoked the Emergency Act to kind of be very striking against these protesters. So there was a way in which the American debate had infected Canadian politics, and the prime minister was on the record saying some not very nice things about Trump and his supporters that I think a lot of Canadians were thinking, well, this means Trump is just going to have his head on a platter. There's no way. He was running on vengeance. He's going to go after Trudeau. And Trudeau walked into the lion's den and seemed to be able to have a civilized conversation. They had a smiley photo. It was all good. So that was my first impression, like amazing.
Mhm.
But Donald Trump seemed to decide that Justin Trudeau takes himself way too seriously. And while he wasn't going to smash Canada, he was going to torture Justin Trudeau. So he started calling him a mere governor. And he's like, it's the 51st state. And Canada really wants to be a 51st state. And they don't want to deal with this Trudeau guy. So I think it started for Trump making fun of Trudeau, trying to poke his big ego. But it became Canada bashing. And it has just continued and it gotten worse and worse and worse to the point that even if we think he's just joking in that not very funny, Trumpy bully way, I'm very concerned that he's done a lot of damage to Canadians' confidence in the relationship with the US that will have consequences for the rest of us for a long time. But anyway, that's my little soapbox. I
Let me
tend
just
to
pick
know
up on that though,
yeah.
because here we go, right? So yeah, I agree with you. It started as trolling, and I think Canadians believe that as well. Until that press conference, and I think it was last week, again, I had to jump and run to talk about this, where he said, no, we're not going to use military force, but we're going to use economic force and get rid of that fake line between the two countries. And Canadians started going, I don't think so. That's where I think
Mhm.
Canadians turned. And it's like, okay, enough with the jokes. We're in a serious situation here. And that's when you also started to see premiers like Premier Doug Ford come out. It was the same day that Trudeau stepped down, and Canadians were looking for someone to stand up and say, enough
Mhm.
of this. And that was the day when Trudeau stepped down that Doug Ford, our Ontario premier, came out. And I got to give him cred for this. He's just like, no, enough of this silliness. If, we are not going to do that. And if you want to impose tariffs on Canada, Canada will retaliate. And I think a lot of Canadians at that point said, thank goodness someone is finally speaking. But then you have the Alberta premier saying, no, we are not going to put tariffs on our oil and gas, and we're not going to retaliate that way. So then what happens is we have all these premiers speaking with different voices. We have a lame duck prime minister who is not controlling the narrative. So as a communications person, bad, very, very bad.
See, and
Um,
I
yeah,
interpret that in two ways. One, I should add that one of the things that both Danielle Smith and Doug Ford said that Trudeau unhelpfully then echoed was that maybe it was time to kick Mexico out of North America and that the
yeah,
USMCA shouldn't, let's forget that. Let's just focus on Canada-US trade and leave the Mexicans out. And I was in Mexico City last week, and I can tell you a lot of the Mexicans I spoke with were, they were used to Trump. They knew they were going to get no nice words from him, but they were not expecting that Canada would talk about that. And it struck me that while there was some anti-Mexicanism in there, it was a lot of if you look at Doug Ford and Danielle Smith, they are the two strongest and best known conservative premiers in the country, with the possible exception of Francois Legault. You could throw him in as well. And at a time when Pierre Poilievre is not out talking about his vision for Canada-US relations or what he's going to do on trade agreements, which people are very concerned about, they stepped into a communications
fill the
vacuum.
void.
And they
Yeah,
said, yeah, we want to say something. Somebody's going to stand up. And so it's a very complicated situation. I agree with you 100%. The result is a mess.
yeah.
But
We
I
are
feel like,
6 days away from a
yeah,
Trump administration and the inauguration. And really, there is no consolidated voice, which is concerning. And I
no,
hate to say that because I don't like to put us in a more precarious situation here in Canada and say those things. Tomorrow, we do know that the premiers are going to sit down with the prime minister and his Canada US team to come up with that unified stance. But what we heard from the foreign affairs minister, and she was on Vashi Kapelas, my colleague at CTV, her show on the weekend, she says everything is on the table. And then you have Danielle Smith, the Alberta premier, heading down to Mar-a-Lago saying, no, it's not. It will cause a national unity crisis. And I'll explain that because oil roughly represents 25% of our total exports to the United States. That's $133 billion in 2023. When Doug Ford, the Ontario Premier, says, okay, we'll deal with electricity, but we need others on side as well. Electricity is about 4.6 billion in exports. However, I want to also mention someone, former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, again, who was also on CTV on the weekend, saying he's not losing sleep over all of this. And I love to hear someone saying they're not losing sleep, because I'm
Especially
just
somebody who's 90. I mean,
91.
I
It
have
was his
trouble
birthday.
sleeping.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was his birthday this past weekend. But he says that essentially, he made a joke and it was kind of funny. He says, fine, then Donald Trump will have to walk up the stairs in Trump Tower in New York with candles to go to his office, because the state of New York relies heavily on energy coming from Canada. That's mainly Quebec Hydro. So that was the joke he made back. That's not what he wants to see, but I did giggle a little bit when he did mention that. So that's what you're looking at when you're looking at exports as well. But when you don't have everybody singing from the same song page, Donald Trump is going, I see that there are lots of cracks in this country right now, and I can get in there.
He loves to divide and conquer. We have a couple questions from the audience, and I'm going to throw one out here. The first
Sure.
one, it's, do you think Trudeau's resignation will alter Canada's standing and influence on a global stage? And particularly, the questioner asks about the G7 and NATO. I'm happy to start, but why don't you start,
You go
actually?
ahead. You go.
Well,
Oh, okay. You go,
no,
Chris.
you start. You start.
See, this is Chris and I. No. You were
After you.
so
No, after
Canadian.
you.
It's like, no, you first. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm gonna let you go first.
Well, I'll just since so polite. So on the
No.
G7, that's a really interesting one, because the last time Canada hosted the G7 in 2018, hosted in Quebec, it was not a bad meeting, but it ended really badly with
Yes.
Donald Trump on a plane calling Justin Trudeau weak and a backstabber, and minions like Peter Navarro and Larry Kudlow coming out and saying very unfortunate things about the Prime Minister. We cleaned some of that up, but Canada hosts again, this time in Alberta in June
Yep. Kananaskis. Yep.
2025. So I think that there has been a lot of thought about what if Justin Trudeau were there again and it was Trump again, and how would that go? Now it looks like there'll be a different host, provided that the Canadian election doesn't get in the way. The other thing that's happening in June is the NATO summit. The next NATO summit will be in the Netherlands, in The Hague in the Netherlands, at the end of June. So we're assuming the G7 will be a little bit earlier in that year, and or earlier in that month. And there, it's kind of interesting. Justin Trudeau last year in May, when we had the summit of the 75th summit of NATO, made the third pledge that Canada has made, that it was going to spend 2% on defense. The first one was made by Stephen Harper at the Wales summit in the UK. The second was made by Justin Trudeau in Vilnius in Lithuania, where he agreed to a 2% floor, no longer aspirational. But then in Washington, he was under a tremendous pressure to actually have a plan, and he put a date on it by 2032. Now, he's not going to be there to deliver on it. Who will be the Prime Minister? We were just saying we don't know, but that person will be under tremendous pressure within NATO to actually repledge to the Trudeau plan, at least by 2032, and then show some concrete action. That would be my first cut at that. Hannah, what's your feeling?
Yeah, so talking about that as well, just one interesting little tidbit. If Donald Trump, who is now a convicted felon, wants to come to Canada, he will have to get special permission for that to happen because of that. So that'll be just fascinating to see how that, yeah, I'm sure they'll give them permission to come. But as a convicted felon, you do have to get special permission to come to Canada because of that conviction. But yeah, when you look at what's happening with the G7 and NATO and spending, it's one of the big things that Donald Trump has been pushing for, is increasing that to 2% of GDP. As Chris mentioned, Canada has promised to do that, but they promised to do it by pushing it down the road. He wants it more now. And we did actually hear from Doug Ford today. I'm just going to pull up a clip talking about this. He says he's going to push the Canadian government tomorrow when they're sitting at the table to start moving towards that, because that's something big that has been a bugaboo for Donald Trump for some time. However, the problem is that our fiscal situation is not very good right now. So where do you get that money from? And when you're heading into an election campaign, is that something that Canadians are really focused on? Would they be cool to go, okay, I'm going to give a little here and spend more on defense? Some, yes, but I'm not sure it will really feature in their heads at this time. They're thinking about their own pocketbooks. But you could spin it back to say, look, if we want to get rid of these tariffs, if those tariffs are imposed, this will help us with that. So what also, and this is something you and I have been talking about as well, one of the other things are critical minerals. Canada is just loaded with critical minerals. And that's something else that Doug Ford, pardon me, too many D's, brought up as well today, that he wants Fortress AmCam is what he's calling it. This was just announced this morning, bright and early. These are things he's going to bring to the Prime Minister's table today. So increasing spending, not waiting those extra years to get to it, expand AI, help with that as well, critical minerals, all of those types of things. So thinking, what do our neighbors to the south really need? What can we provide? And how do we move forward on this? And you know what? Even though we might be critical of Donald Trump for saying, hey, make us the 51st state, start saying we're going to have an economic takeover, it's made us start thinking about, those types of policies. How do we become more independent? How do we start focusing on things that Canada can do better and supply to the rest of the world and stop these types of things and the frustrations? Another thing that Donald Trump wanted was more on border spending. Canada did commit to that in the fall fiscal update, 1.3 billion over 6 years to strengthen border security and immigration. So they have promised that, but remember when the House was prorogued, that didn't get passed. So prorogued or suspended. So that will have to come back as well.
I think that's one of the great things about Canada, and I say this as an American, is that time and time again, when the U.S. has made a request, Canadians do give it consideration, even if it's being made by Donald Trump. And I think on 2% on defense, there is a broader sense among Canadians than I've seen in quite a long time that the world has become dangerous. It's Vladimir Putin, it's China. So 2% doesn't anymore get a kind of brush off from Canadians. They understand that whether it's 2 or 3 or what the number is, that spending more on defense does seem necessary in a dangerous world. But I think you're right.
Take care of our Arctic.
Take care of the Arctic. Yes, finding ways to do that.
Yeah,
absolutely. So the second question really builds on that first one, and it's here. Are there any specific domestic or international policies that were initiated by Trudeau that could be at risk of being rolled back under a new leader? And you mentioned the carbon tax, but what else? This is a very well-written question because it's a new leader. So it could be a new Liberal leader, but it could also be a new Conservative, depending on how the election goes.
Yeah, there's a lot of the environmental issues, if it's a new Conservative leader, that would be rolled back by that government. And they've made it clear that they are going to refocus energies, in particular the carbon tax gone, scrap first day. That is something they have promised multiple times. There's also, one of the things is our tax system is a little bit complicated here. It is not really friendly for investment. And they have a new tax that they implemented, and really it hadn't passed, but they're still putting it through here in Canada. That makes it problematic for other countries to come in. So those are the types of things that economists are saying a new government really has to focus on making the tax system less burden, a smaller burden for companies coming into this country, so we can have more investment and compete with the United States. Because look, if we're going to have stricter rules for them, uh, capital gains has to be considered, all of those types of things. So those are the things we're going to start seeing um, people here consider and rolling back. A lot of the environmental stuff as well is something that we have to look at. We have methane regulations that are coming through. Um, there are a whole list of things that we have to take a look at to see, will they continue on with a new Liberal leader? And I actually, even when it comes to the carbon tax, you might see that change under a new Liberal leader as well.
Two very important things, and I would just add to that, there's an abstract concern, abstract in the sense that I think a lot of us, it's hard to put your finger on it, and that is the concern about Canada's productivity relative to the US. And
Yes.
for some people, that's a question of investment. And compared to the United States, investment in new equipment and machinery is slower, and that's partly because the US tax system is more favorable to making those kinds of investments. But as a result, the US is upping technology on a faster pace, so we tend to get more productive as time goes on, and Canadians, bless them, are out there using last year's machines, trying to figure out what can we squeak out of that machinery so that we can put off the big investment a little bit longer, because the tax system doesn't allow them to write that off or depreciate it nearly as fast. And then there are other questions about whether workers are as productive, and that's always politically sensitive. But I think there are a lot of economists and a lot of Canadians worried that that gap is making Canadians poorer. And there was some data that has come out of Statistics Canada. It's been echoed by the OECD, and some of the people on the call might be familiar with it, suggesting that Canada, if it were the 51st state, would rank behind all 50 states in terms of per capita income. And that is a real shock, because even the poorest of US states are better on a per capita basis in terms of GDP and output and quality of life than what's going on in Canada. That has a lot of Canadians unhappy. It's something conservatives have embraced as Canada is broken, and they've talked about major reforms. But the problem with productivity is it is one of those sleeper issues. It's a bit abstract. It's hard to see how you translate that into something that can move quickly and convince people of a gain. The other issue that I think has come up quite a bit, and is one that I think a lot of Californians can relate to, is the question of immigration. And for a long
Yes.
time, Canada was extremely pro-immigration because it had a system that picked people with advanced degrees, people who came with investment money, people who were really able to assimilate successfully into Canadian society without losing their international diversity, etc. So they brought a lot of color and charm to the country, made it more multicultural, but by and large, they thrived. And because of that thriving, Canadians felt good about the society and everyone loved immigration. But what's happened, and this is a situation the US has faced for some time, is that the number of stateless and displaced people, combined with the number of people who are fleeing for economic, trying to find a better life, is quite high. And the UN last year estimated that, I think in April was the latest number we had from 2024, that we had 120 million stateless and displaced people in the world right now. And that's Ukrainians and Venezuelans and Haitians and people from Syria and so many other places
Yeah.
that are suffering. And they're looking for countries that have enough wealth that they could start over. They're not looking to, hide for a while and then go back. They're feeling like it's just so bad they might as well start over. Canada, the US, countries of immigrants have always been very top of the list. But what surprised me a little bit is to see Canada, as people have started to realize that these new immigrants who are coming to Canada, sometimes crossing the US border, coming in from the US on the land border, are in much more need of help. They often don't have English or French. They're often struggling with basic skills. They're trying to succeed as well, obviously, but they need
Housing's
more.
a problem.
Housing's a problem. Canada doesn't have the housing.
Healthcare systems being pushed.
Being strained. So it's a debate in Canada that is starting to have some of the echoes of the US debate. a clear challenge, though, for policymakers to figure out how do we be welcoming to those who need to come and be compassionate while at the same time trying to figure out how to provide the services so that those newcomers are not coming at the expense of our current population, but also have what they need to succeed. And that's a very tough debate in Canada as it is in the US, but that's changed
Yeah.
relatively recently.
It just changed recently. I would say that Canadians aren't anti-immigration. I would say that we just need to have the um, we have to have the proper housing. We have to have the healthcare because a lot of Canadians are going in and they can't get family doctors. And then they say, oh, well, if we don't have enough family doctors, how can we let more people in? It becomes that type of question. And then I think finally the federal government realized this because, as you mentioned, it backtracked on its own policies of letting in so many immigrants. And that was only last October.
Mhm.
So you look at that, and if you look at our economy too, we haven't, it's exactly what you're saying, Chris. We haven't grown because of productivity. We've grown because of the amount of immigrants that we've let in our country. But then you get this other problem that hasn't really been considered and put in the mix. So productivity is, like you say, it's one of these sleeper issues that needs to be discussed and needs to be discussed thoroughly. And I talk to people who run ports, and what they're saying is they want to transition to AI, which would make things much more productive. However, the unions are concerned that that'll take jobs away. And then they say, okay, well, we'll create 2 jobs for the one that we're going to take away because they have to run these machines, but then the unions say those aren't the type of jobs they want. So there's all
Right.
that push and pull as well. But productivity, something that has to be discussed very quickly and really thought of. It is, as you say, Chris, it's a sleeper issue, but a really important one.
And what I want to ask you about a little bit, since we've
Mhm.
kind of hit the big questions, and if you have a question and you're watching, just there's a Q&A box at the bottom. You can just put a question in. We'd be happy to answer it.
We
Um,
love
but I,
taking questions.
but I wanted to ask you a question about Quebec because Quebec for immigration and other things has been quite interesting. We've
Yep.
seen a couple pieces of legislation that have been very controversial in Quebec about asserting the French language in the province and so on. So can you talk a little bit about how Quebec fits into this? Because I think it's one of the provinces most Americans are sort of aware of. It sort of stands out because of its French character.
Yeah, absolutely. When you look at Quebec, it's very distinct. Even if you go there and you talk about things like entertainment, they have stars there that are huge stars that the rest of Canada doesn't really know about. Like that's just a very simplistic thing. But also their politics is much different than the rest of Canada. They have, I think it's 89 seats, and I stand to be corrected, of the 338 in the rest of this country. That means, yeah, are you looking at that right now?
Yep, 78 altogether. But
78.
still, yes.
Yeah. But that
Don't
is,
worry.
but that's a big chunk of seats. So when it comes to focus, every person who runs for prime minister in this country has to be bilingual because you have to speak. We are a bilingual country, but if you look at Quebec and the amount of seats that they have there, they have to always continue to focus on that province and what their needs are. Their needs are a bit different too, because they, as Chris was saying, they have a very strong language, and they want to ensure that that is maintained. So their language laws are different. They also, they have to ensure that all of those things are focused on when they run in those provinces. We've had multiple prime ministers from Quebec. Justin Trudeau's from there. Jean Chrétien. Oh, I'm trying to think. Is there anyone from there in this race? Not at this point that I
No,
know.
and that's interesting. Some of the viewers
Yeah.
may not know Pierre Poilievre. If you looked at his name, you might say, well, he's French Canadian, but he's actually from Calgary. He's from Western Canada.
And he originally, and this goes way back to my time, pronounced it Poliver and did flip to the Polyev pronunciation a little bit later. And his French is very good. Very good. So, it's definitely in Canada that that province, when they say they're very distinct. So even when the federation meets and the premiers meet, they might say, yes, we'll take this money, but we are not going to put it towards what you say it has to be put towards, because we are going to do things our way, because we are a distinct society, all of those types of issues. So when you're dealing with a province like that, and actually, you know what? If I think right now about the discussions on tariffs, we haven't heard as much from Premier Legault at this point in time. I'm sure it will happen, but he's kind of, I think, just kind of sitting back and waiting to see what happens and then potentially react. But I'll be watching tomorrow for sure to see how things come out of those discussions.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I didn't want to let Quebec go. And now you're from the East Coast.
I'm from the
Uh,
East Coast, Yarmouth, Nova
so
Scotia. Everybody should look it up. It's a great town.
Well,
Southwest.
Nova Scotia just had an election in November. We had an election in New Brunswick that brought a sudden twist because we'd had Blaine Higgs, a conservative government. Now we have a liberal government. We've got a liberal government in Newfoundland and Labrador, and I'm trying to remember. Prince Edward Island, I think,
Conservative.
is conservative.
Yep.
So talk a little bit about Atlantic Canada. So people know those provinces, probably think of them with New England. They have some similarities, but how are things going there, and how do you expect they will do in the next election? Where will they lean? Liberal, conservative, something else?
Okay, so right now, when it comes to Atlantic Canada, yes, think of New England when you think of the people. However, during COVID, what happened is we really saw in the East Coast a growth in population. So that really showed that it was this interesting place to live, and people are staying, which is helping with the economy out there. So the economy is really growing. There was also the recent deal, the hydroelectric deal between Quebec and Newfoundland and Labrador. That is Churchill Falls.
Mhm.
I don't want to get into all of Churchill Falls, but it is a big deal out in the East Coast. It's going to bring in a lot of money for Newfoundland and Labrador. So they re-signed that agreement, made it more beneficial for Newfoundland and Labrador. I would say out in that coast, you are starting to see a lot of, they want to deal with AI. They want to have those centers out there. We have a lot of talented workers in the East Coast that could do those types of jobs. So they're starting to look for that. It's not just the traditional tourism, fishing. Yes, those things are very important for the economy in the East Coast, but it's really starting to grow. And in fact, our business is growing out there as well because of these the growth in population, the growth in the industries out there. There's oil and gas, there's natural, there's windmills, wind power, there's sea power. Like, you just think of all the potential out there. You can see I get very excited about this. When it comes to politics, as you mentioned, they have different types of governments out there. But what I'm hearing from people on the ground is the very simplistic thing too, is that they do not like Justin Trudeau anymore. Would a new leader change that? I'm not 100% sure. I do think that there could be a potential for it. They want to see a federal government that is going to help them with their pocketbooks as well, because they've been hit very hard over the last few years, and they want to focus on the economy. Everybody seems to be that globally right now. So if they can see that a government is starting to go back to the middle, or a liberal government go back towards the middle, it might convince them. I'm not 100% sure. Pierre Poilievre has been doing a good job on getting his message out there for the past couple of years. People are listening to that. It's resonating for them. And it might be too late for them to switch the channel with a new leader in the Liberal Party, because really they have weeks to do this.
I want to give you,
Yep.
I know we're close to time, so I want to give you a chance to also talk about British Columbia, the other West Coast there. They just had a provincial election, came out right on a razor's edge between
Yes.
the NDP, which has formed the government and the opposition, and that has been a tradition. We saw a couple of very close governments under the previous Premier John Horgan, and it's just been a very tight situation there. What's going on the west coast of Canada, and what are they thinking about the future in the Indo-Pacific and the relationship with California? Where are they looking at the world?
It's the same thing with them when it comes to changing of governments. They are like in that election campaign, they were thinking, do we need a change here? Because of the fact that they are considering all these different issues that are hitting, like you say, came through with a razor's edge. On that one, they have an NDP government in there. So expect the policies that we've seen in the past to continue. When it comes to the federal election, though, a lot of the MPs are concerned about their seats out there. However, there is someone who is throwing their name into the race, Jonathan Wilkinson, who is a cabinet member. We are hearing that he will likely run in the federal Liberal leadership race at this time. Who knows if things will change?
Well, and Christy Clark, the former Premier
Oh
of
my
British
gosh,
Columbia, has
how
been
could I
discussed
forget
as
about
well.
Christy Clark? Oh
Yeah.
yeah, how could I forget about Christy Clark? She's expected to announce this week. She's a former premier of British Columbia, former Liberal premier, but politics out there is a bit different when it comes to that.
Well, I think that's
Yeah,
a
sorry.
great moment to end on. And for Americans, it is very similar. After the 60s and so on, there was a real desire to hear from California. People thought, let's look west to sort of the future. I think a lot of Canadians are looking west to the future as well. They're kind of resonating. But
I just pick
at
up
the
on
end,
one thing that's
oh,
going to be
please.
big out west. And this was
Mm,
something that our American ambassador was talking about. One of the big things, it's the biggest sporting event globally. It's not the Olympics, it's the World Cup. That is an opportunity for us to work together on different issues because it's taking place in 3 different countries. East and BC is going to be one of the provinces that it takes place in. Infrastructure needs,
yep.
start dealing with those issues together as a team. And sorry, I jumped in because I know we're hitting the time, but
No, that
that's
is an
something
absolutely important.
huge.
It is huge. The FIFA World Cup in 2026, the Biden administration had us on a good track to coordinating that, but obviously LA was hosting a number of those games, and that's going to be a really a challenge with recovering from the wildfires. And I would add to that, LA is hosting the Summer Olympics in 2028, which will be the last year of this current new administration that we're starting next Monday. So there are some big promises that have been made by past governments, some very exciting things we could do together, but also some big threats coming out of Washington that have divided, not conquered, but divided Canada. And it couldn't be a more interesting time to talk about Canada-US relations and both the promise and the peril of the next few years. And I hope the Pacific Council and the people watching today will stay interested, stay engaged. And I don't want to speak for you, Hannah, but I'd come back anytime you want to talk.
Absolutely. There's so much more to dig into. And just so you know, everyone, I'll say up here in Canada, we are thinking of you, and we're so happy that we could send some help down as well to help with those fires. We're sending you all the positive thoughts that we
Well, you
can.
know what wildfires are like. The last couple of years,
Yes,
Canada's been incredible.
and we appreciated the help from the United States as well. So that just shows how friends can work together.
Let's end on that positive note and hope for recovery for everyone.
Absolutely.
This has been Chris Sands here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, Hannah Thibedeau from the Global Public Affairs Office in Ottawa.
Ottawa,
Uh,
snowy Ottawa right now.
I guess because I know what your office looks like. And big thanks to Duncan Wood and to the Pacific Council for hosting us. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Thank you kindly.